Welcome to day 2 panel discussion, social behavior and emotions. For those who are still a little curious about the video, with the lemon, it's a comment on a trend that sometimes occurs in our passion to understand dogs. And when we don't understand something, sometimes we create an explanation that doesn't do them justice, such as a very famous expression that they're just lemon brains. And that's not enough for us to continue our understanding of dog behavior. So I blew up that lemon. And so the idea of promoting continuing research and continuing to ask questions to understand the whys is part of that exploration to break those barriers. So with that, a wonderful day of presentations. I wanted to start out going back to play. And Dr. Beckhoff had proposed a few definitions about the possible functions and reasons why animals play, such as training for the unexpected and such. But Kathryn, your presentation offered some different ideas about how play functions. What are some of the differences? Let's dive into that.
Well, so the hypothesis that I proposed and tested was the idea that play did not originate for a particular function, but rather originated as a byproduct of the development of an animal from an early adapted neonate to a later completely different adapted adult. And the beauty of that hypothesis is that it does not exclude later evolution of different functions. So once the play as a behavior exists, it can be shaped by natural selection for different functions, such as developing cognition in primates or coordination in ungulates, etc.
So we can have multiple functions with these, so we don't have necessarily a single aspect going on. But the play bow is pretty common.
Yeah, so I mentioned in my presentation that we had a different idea of the play bow. When we see the play bow, I don't think that it's particularly a motor pattern that's been selected for. Again, I think it's a byproduct. And this is something that Ray has discussed before as well, that if you have a situation where you're unsure as to whether to go forward or backward, the play bow is actually the perfect position to be in, because you can both push off to go backwards with your front feet or proceed forward with your action. And in a situation where you're unsure of what's going to happen, it gives you an opportunity to decide which way to go. So in a situation where it's chaotic and you think that you might be about to get bit, you'd want to take a moment to figure out which way to go. And we actually don't just see this in play. We see it in serious hunting situations where wolves will actually play bow at bison. And it usually happens once they've gotten very close and they may get gored. And so instead of continuing on with the hunting behavior, they get down into this position to decide whether to run away or continue on. Which the other option of explaining that as a play bow would be that they're lying to the bison and trying to fool them into playing, which involves a much more complicated cognitive explanation. So if we use Occam's razor, the play bow is just a conflict, is a simpler explanation.
In the earlier ethology interpretations of the play bow, I called it a derived activity. It was a highly ritualized derived activity from stretching. And the wolves taught me this. All the wolves are napping, and then one gets up and stretches. But it usually does not just stretch somewhere in space, it stretches towards another wolf and then goes forwards. And I see it as a highly ritualized display of relaxation. They stretch to relax, but they will socially direct it. So as derived behavior, it becomes a signal to establish a relaxed mood or a non-serious mood. And one of the terms that we used in play behavior was meta-communication. It's communication about communication. And as for giving this play bow and looking playful towards a bison or whatever, this is called fascination behavior or tolling. And there are certain breeds of dog, the French duck toll, I believe, that will see the ducks in the lake and run up and down and start doing play bows and chasing his tail and so on. And the ducks or the geese become curious and come out of the water to see what crazy creature this is. And lo and behold, they'll do it. And I've seen young sheepdogs do this to the chickens in the yard. Woo, woo, woo. Same to you.
The only problem with that is that in order for the metacommunication explanation to work, you need to assume a higher level of cognition. And so you can explain the exact same behavior with it merely being a conflict behavior without that complex underlying assumption. And therefore, unless we have data to prove otherwise, that is the explanation we should start with.
Well, at the risk of being a little bit agreeable, and I will say that I think that idea of the function of play and of play bows secondarily doesn't actually contradict the earlier ethological explanation of play. I mean, there was always a search for function because every evolutionary biologist wants to have a function for behaviors, and play was difficult because there was no function that then played out, as it were. If you didn't have practice for fighting, you still wound up being a fighter. At least that was what a little bit of evidence that was accumulated showed. So there was no function that came forward as the main explanation. So it might have been this incidental behavior that then was co-opted and has another use. And when I've studied play and play bows usage in particular in dogs, what I was interested in particular was that they used the play bows non-randomly, and Mark has shown this as well. And they also used attention getters in combination with play signals. So they were not just sort of stretching towards other conspecifics and not doing it outside of a context particularly where play might occur, but doing it before play and doing it when there had been an act which could be misinterpreted in play. And so they came to be meaningful, and that's different than saying that's the function, that's why they're doing it, but they certainly have that meaningful role in the context of play, and I think that makes it a behavior that we can look at ethologically.
Can I come in on the function of play? Because one of my students, Lindsay Meerkamp, is in the middle of carrying out a study based on an accidental discovery that comes from just leaving video cameras running when you're not around. And she first noticed this with wolf-dog hybrids, but the same it's clearly true with dogs as well. And that is that dogs play to get our attention. And when we walk away, when there are no people there, the dogs are far less likely to play. They rest, and then the same pair house dogs, the same pair of dogs will play much more when a person is paying attention to them. And maybe, again, if I get invited back next year, we've got video of person in their home, person with 2 dogs, doing her homework. These are all students. Doing her homework, the dogs ignore her. But she turns and she attends to one of the dogs, and the 2 dogs start playing. It's actually, to some degree, a performance to encourage human attention.
Ray, I see you look like you want to jump in on this.
You were wrong. I've worked a lot on play, and for years and years and years as a student, which must be 100 years ago now, play was always defined as non-functional. And so the psychologists and others who studied it wondered how you can get the evolution of a set of behaviors that is non-functional. In other words, if you're looking at what Kathryn did with the eye stalk, chase, and bite, well, you do eye stalk and chase and bite, and at the end of that eye stalk, chase, and bite is lunch or dinner or this week's food. When you do reproductive behaviors, you have parental behaviors, you have hazard avoidance behaviors, and they run in lineages, in the carnivores, not just the dogs and the wolves and so forth, but in the carnivores you have these eye stalk patterns, and they're functional. You can just go out and observe them, and they are functional. The problem with play was that it was never functional. It didn't end up with an immediate reward. And so people had to propose an alternative to it. It's very obvious that animals play. And so where is it coming from? And for a long time, the community that studied these things said, well, it must be kind of a learning process. It must be practicing for being an adult. It must be, and they had to develop some kind of long-term solution to why the animals did these particular motor patterns. And then we began to change and all of a sudden realized, and I think what Kathryn said is most important, is that the animals that play the most are mammals. And yes, you can find illustrations in the rest of the animal world that could be interpreted as play, but as a matter of fact, it's characteristic of mammals. And as a matter of fact, the frequency of it is higher in young mammals. It's not high in neonates. Neonates rarely ever do that. And as a matter of fact, when you go out there in the wild world and you look at most animals, they don't play as adults. All right, they play as juveniles. And so Kathryn's suggested a model here where the transition between those neonatal motor patterns of occupying an environment that includes mother, and then having the offset of those neonatal behaviors and the onset of the adult behaviors mixed together gives you something that doesn't look functional. And so the suggestion is that's the basis of play. Now, that doesn't mean that when the animal goes through some sequence, I wrote a paper on this one time, and if the animal goes through some play sequence and it does, for whatever, some emergent reason, become functional, the animal can learn to repeat it and learn to repeat it, all right? And if it's not functional at all, then you just call it play and move on. So the difference between learning and play is whether you can put together those motor patterns in a functional sequence or not.
Michael?
Not to keep playing with a dead horse, but Konrad Lorenz would use the term instinct training interlocking. And many of the fixed motor patterns or action that you see in play behavior are inbuilt, and the animal rearranges. And it's the activity in itself which is rewarding. And that's the subtlety of play. It's rewarding in itself. And recently, with dogs running, they found a correlation between why dogs enjoy running and runners get a high. They found in the serum of dogs that there are cannabinoids, which are chemicals that you find in marijuana. Because dogs, like humans, have cannabinoid receptors in their brains which link up with pleasurable experiences. And this is quite a fascinating aspect of dog behavior, why they love to run. And I'd like to know what the level of cannabinoid release is during strong physical play behavior, as well as the other feel-good neuroendocrine transmitters, such as oxytocin, that are released.
Great.
To also play the dead horse, is that the expression?
Or live puppy, whichever you prefer.
The problem with that argument is, I agree with it, is that when you look at, when I go out there and I look at an animal do any motor pattern, they find out that there's an internal reward. And so you have this motivation, internal motivation for performing eye stalk chase or whatever. And every time the animal does it, then you get one of these endorphin releases or something in specific centers in the brain. So when I go out there and watch a border collie come up on, do the eye stalk behavior and come up on a sheep, quite often they get hung up there. They're right there, and they're hung up in the stalk, and you watch, and their eyes dilate, and so forth, and they look like they're having an orgasm. All right, and that's exactly what's happened. And you said it earlier today. That's all of a sudden the release of those chemicals in the brain and so forth are whatever. So, but that's true on the functional motor patterns as well as it is on the play motor patterns. And I would think that the play motor patterns would release these endorphins because, as a matter of fact, they are motor patterns. They just mixed in a funny way. So there's no reason to assume that they wouldn't be rewarded.
So going to the Twitter feed, let's see. I had a question here for Kathryn. Jumping over to keeping with the theme of motor patterns, have you looked at differences in motor development of puppies between breeds, and how about so-called primitive breeds?
So I'm assuming they're talking about village dogs and Basenjis and things like that.
Yeah, the question doesn't state. I know that there's, I believe it is Ostrander's work, there's 9 Huskies, Malamutes, Akitas, Shibas, Chow Chow, Shar-Peis, Basenjis, something else.
Well, the first thing I'd say is that for the breeds, there's no particular breed that's more ancient than another, according to Lawson's work. They're all about 115 years old at this point. You can't keep it going for that long. But as far as the village dogs, which are an interesting case because we have these animals living in a different situation, we don't see a lot of the predatory motor patterns in the village dogs, and it's most likely because they get culled out of the system. And they're a lot like the guard dogs, which Ray's actually looked at and found evidence that we do not see the predatory motor patterns during the critical period. They turn on later. But I think, again, just like I was saying with the border collies, this isn't a system of them not being able to produce those motor patterns as adults. They just have very high thresholds. So if there's been, Ray has had reports of livestock guarding dogs that have been very attentive and very good with the sheep and never hunted them or anything like that, but all of a sudden a rabbit runs right under their nose and they go through the complete sequence. So if you get a high enough threshold, it's in there, but it's extremely difficult to elicit. So I'd imagine it's a very similar thing with the livestock guarding dogs, where you have a very high threshold for any of those motor patterns, or they'd be culled out of the system.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point that Kathryn is making about the primitive or prototypical village dogs. Those that I saw in India, those brought into our sanctuary, were remarkably disinterested in the chickens and the small orphan animals that we had around. And I think there was a very strong community selection against puppies who started showing frank predatorial behavior on the small livestock that these people were keeping, such as chickens, ducks, and little kids and so forth.
I think that the question, when the question comes back and it talks about primitive dogs, I don't think that the questioner is asking about village dogs. I think that the questioner is saying that there are certain breeds, whether they be Basenjis or Siberian Huskies or whatever, that are primitive, are ancient. And when you look at the literature, when you look at the genetic literature, and people say, all right, well, we're going to look at a primitive breed, meaning that they date way back. And that's, it's a good question, and it's a common question and so forth. But for somebody who is really, I can't believe that some of the geneticists will go and say, all right, we want to look at the evolution or the lineage of a primitive breed like the Siberian Husky. All right, that one drives me nuts because being an old sled dog racer and so on, I wouldn't let a Siberian Husky in the yard. And the reason is that the Siberian Huskies were all descended from 15 dogs at Wanalancet Kennel in 1934. They were brought out there by this guy, Leonard Seppala, and he sold them. He talked the New England Brahmins into this new breed of dogs and whatever else. And they actually, in order to keep, they developed a breed standard for these dogs and so on. But in order to get the background, they actually bred them in with what they call a Canadian or a Canuck hound, which were winning all the sled dog races at the time. You go back and you look at the race at Lake Placid in 1932, I think. You know, there wasn't one by Siberian Huskies. I think they were something like 16th or something. The Canadians came in there with their hounds, and they did they're great dog breeders. But so anyway, if you think Siberian Huskies are ancient because you can trace them back to Siberia, you're wrong. You can trace them back to Wanalancet Kennel, and that's as far as you can go. And so that's true of lots of things. The Basenji is another favorite one that is, I mean, basically that lady who brought the Basenjis back to England, you know, only brought less than a handful of animals. So when you look at the Great Pyrenees, the breed itself starts with a handful of animals, and it's all written. You can read it. You know, golden retrievers trace back to two brothers. If you're going to trace them back as ancient, you know, you got a genetic problem on your hand.
So jumping a little bit, but it's going to come back to you, Ray, in a second. But Adam, I have a question from the Twitter feed. In your looking at attachment, what about rescue dogs that had no previous attachment? The attachment study that you were discussing, is their assumption is that it was only dogs raised as pups. Is that correct?
And why would the rescue dog and doesn't have attachment? I wasn't sure in the question. Why?
Let's see. Let me reread the question. What about rescue dogs that had no?
Have-
Oh, so I guess the question we could look at it a different way. So you showed that dogs who were raised as pups showed strong attachment. But what about rescue dogs that had no previous attachment?
Oh, okay. So rescue dogs, you mean? Okay. Well, I mean, yeah. So that's really a problem, especially, for example, in situations where these dogs that are rescued had very different contact with people. And that was also mentioned, actually, I think, in Livestock, that you don't have a dog that it's immediately attached to people. You really need to be exposed to people, and then on top of this, actually, the attachment might develop. So, and sometimes that's also a concern if people go and rescue dogs from a street, and when these dogs have been not exposed to people at all, or actually they are feared from people because in that particular situations people don't like them, so dogs are actually suffering or fear people. So I think in this case, I'm always a little bit also against having the dog and forcing the dog to live with humans, because of course you can make some changes, but I think in that case, and also it was mentioned in other talks today, that the critical phase is important. So usually I think that if a dog was grown up in a family or had a sort of, let's put it this way, friendly relationship with people, then ended up in a rescue center and dog shelter, then it's nice to provide a new family for him or her. But if it was really living for all his younger life away from people, or even in a situation where they had to fear people, I'm a little bit concerned when he's or she's then forced to live in family, and people see it as they rescue a dog, probably despite he might actually not be one to be rescued at all.
On a similar line, talking about the attachment data, someone has a question asking whether or not your data, and perhaps Ray, you can jump on this, they thought that it flew in the face, so to speak, of your assertion that livestock guardian dogs should be raised hands-off. Is there a conflict in these ideas?
Sorry, but I didn't understand the question.
So the idea of the social base and how we should be raising dogs and understanding their function of attachment as they grow up. In your book, Dogs, you discuss how we should take a livestock guardian dog and place them with the sheep. And
Yeah, all right, I got it. I just rewrote the chapter on the evolution of dogs in the Temple Grandin book, and it's now out. And it lists in there 5 kinds of dogs. And it's the village dog. From the way I look at the world, the village dog is the kind of the dog that's out there, whether it was the first dog or whatever else. It's the dog out there that's now occupying that niche. And then The second category is livestock guarding dogs, and they're probably the most populous working dog in the world. And the reason for that is that they're just village dogs that were raised in pastoral societies. All right, so you have people out there and they're doing a variety of things. They're gardening, or they're pastoralist in the sense that they have sheep in the backyard, or they're lots of sheep and goat and camel pastoralists are nomadic or semi-nomadic or transhumans, however you want to define those terms. And so the dogs go on some long trek with the sheep once or twice a year or continuously. And so that shapes, that was that land race population that I told you about yesterday when we get the talk. You know, there was that population of dogs, and it was divided up into a bunch of things which are not breeds. Nobody's breeding dogs. They're land race dogs, and they're selected, you know, by natural selection or by culling for some particular kind of human activity. So when we tried to introduce livestock guarding dogs into America, the mistake that we made in the early days, we didn't understand that the dog was a cultural response, both through their critical period for social development. If they don't grow up in an environment, if they don't grow up in the barns and the sheep pens and so forth, I don't care what you do with the genetics, they're not going to work. All right, so it's one of those environmental responses, and it probably works on almost any dog.
Well, actually, what I might add is that we have heard today a lot about the sensitive period, and I think what we really haven't really touched upon really, and it would be sort of a nice experiment to do, although I don't know how to do it, is really whether, in addition to having this sensitive period, dogs have also a preference, and in this case I would mean a genetic preference for humans. And my idea would, I'm not sure what would be the result, but very easy I can imagine that the sensitive period is actually just longer and a little bit different, but there's no preference for humans. Actually, there are some old experiments when people raise dogs with rabbits and other animals, and they showed affiliative behaviors towards them. So I think what we made to the dogs is just changing somehow the sensitive period, and then depending on what sort of environment they get in, then they will show these affiliative behaviors toward that. So whether it's a sheep or a human, that will actually then define their later behavior. So, and I don't see this as a controversial here. I think there are no general rules of how you should raise a dog. It depends very much, and as I think Ray was saying this, that this is actually, so in the mind of those people who actually started this whole idea to live together with dogs, they have very clear functional, even if they didn't express it that way, they had some goals, some targets, why they doing what. And for them, it was quite natural that if they wanted a dog to work with sheep, then they had that sort of, if you like, attachment or socialization. And if they wanted a dog that lives with people, they obviously offer that sort of environment. So it's not like good or bad, it just depends on what you want.
Mary has been waiting very patiently. Mary, would you like to ask a question of the panel?
Yes, my question is there a way to push out the critical socialization window, either nutritionally or pharmacologically, in dogs?
I believe there's some interesting, maybe Michael, I remember talking about some oxytocin.
Yeah, well, I would put that aside and ask why. Nutritional genomics or special prescription diets for that, or using some kind of pharmaceutical enhancement, I think is the kind of path that could create a dependency. And this is the problem with veterinary and human medicine, that we are keeping certain life forms alive or certain genetic mutants that probably should not be continued when they need certain kinds of maintenance to maintain their normal physiological and psychological function. So I'd be very leery. But certainly malnutrition can stunt development. Malnutrition can stunt emotional intelligence and cognitive abilities, whether we're talking about children or puppies. And good nutrition is the best way of keeping that critical period, sensitive period, whatever you want to call it, within its optimum range.
Ray, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, just to continue on it, on what Michael said, is when you're looking at a set of behaviors and you say these behaviors are genetic, so when Kathryn was talking this morning, she talked about these being these genes or whatever it is that's giving those particular motor patterns and building them in differently in the different breeds of dogs. Can they be changed? Can the timing be changed and so on? Yeah, well, can your foot be changed? I mean, I could put your foot in a cast. I could prevent you from walking or something, and when you became an adult, you would have a different shape or size or something foot. And so you can do the same thing with any organ or any organ system, including behavior. And you could see from her experiments this morning, you remember that there was a difference in onset pattern of certain kinds of behaviors, whether the dog was raised by the female or whether it was hand raised. And actually, when you did those experiments, I remember there was actually at some point a little difference in head shape between the hand-raised and the mother-raised dogs. So yeah, there is an environmental input. But like your foot, you can make it a little shorter. It's tough to make it a little longer. You can screw it up, but it's tough to make it much better.
Kind of along those same lines, at the shelter that I work at, puppies come back at 8 weeks of age, get spayed or neutered, and out on the adoption floor. Luckily at my shelter, they end up getting adopted in a day or two. But knowing what we know about critical periods, what would your advice be for shelters and breeders as far as dealing with that transition period?
Any takers?
I can take it, although I'm sure that others have really useful opinions as well. So I think there's a lot of research to be done in that area, because I've heard a lot of the same sorts of concerns from many in that field, and there are these studies on attachment that are a great start to that, but there are questions like, should we foster out animals? What if animals are, dogs forming these multiple potential attachments that Ádám mentioned that they might be prone to do? And in my own studies, I also find even within just a couple of minutes of one of my students walking in, they show a lot of the same attachment pattern behaviors. And so I've heard this sort of controversy of, do we want the dogs to attach to these foster parents or not? Is that going to screw up their later attachments? And it does seem that they are very well prepared to form these various attachments. If you look back to the human literature for children that were in orphanages or had the opportunity potentially, if you think back to like the Romanian orphanage study, if you've heard of that, where they're very socially deprived compared to children who have had the experience of forming multiple relationships or multiple true attachments, you often find that those that have had that opportunity to form multiple attachments do better. And so I think the same types of experiments need to be done on dogs. I'm hoping to start up some of that research, but I think there are things we could look at to provide advice in that vein, and I think some of it's already started.
I would just add to that, I think everything Monique said I agree with, but suddenly doing things right at the end of the critical period can potentially be traumatizing. So if the dog hadn't had any experience with being separated from its siblings, and suddenly you whisk it off by itself in a car and throw it in a veterinary office, you have the potential to cause trauma there, and it would be less likely to cause trauma if you did it before or after that point. Of course, then you have to deal with all the potential issues with, what kind of hormone imbalances you're having and things like that, which is a whole nother discussion, and we don't really know a lot about it. But suddenly doing something brand new right at the end of the critical period is potentially a cause for concern.
Please.
Very briefly, we're talking here about young puppies, even a bit beyond the critical period, that are in the shelter situation. And it was René Spitz many years ago who described the syndrome in orphan children called marasmus. They started to waste away physically. And that was because of the emotional deprivation, the lack of human contact. And it was a fellow called Norman Blecher or Bleicher. I think he was working in an animal laboratory where they were providing beagle puppies for research. And he found that the little beagle puppies were just not thriving, so he got the handlers to go into the enclosures and give these little puppies a period of human contact and lots of play and interaction on a regular basis. And he monitored their weight and their health, and they all improved. And he brought out the term of marasmus, wasting, and emotional deprivation applied to puppies. And I think that was back in the late 50s, early 60s. So there is a good history behind this. And it's essentially common sense. Get in there and play with them in the animal shelter.
I just add to that, that if what you should be doing during the first 8 weeks of life is whatever you want that dog to do as an adult. So you can raise a puppy in a kennel, and it will be perfectly happy living in a kennel. But if you then take the puppy that you raised in the kennel and put it in a house, it will be horrified. Similarly, if you raise it in a house and put it in a kennel, it'll be horrified. Or if you raise it out as a village dog and put it in a house, it'll be horrified. So they're very plastic at that point, and you can raise them in a lot of different situations. But once you have that brain developed and you try to change it, that's when you get some really serious issues.
And another point to add here, there was a veterinarian, I think, in Texas or Kansas who wrote a little book that I can't find, but he described what I described called cradling. When you have a very fractious little puppy that, is just all over the place, just hold that puppy. And I saw a Canadian video of therapists holding teenagers who were acting out in this kind of halfway house, and their therapy was hugging. That when there is completely passive constraint, so the animal is not hurt, but struggles until he or she completely relaxes, and then you put the animal down, and then you pick it up again. So this veterinarian was seeing all these little toy dogs coming in that were spoilt little monsters, little Peter Pans, and he would take them into the back room and give them half an hour session of cradling. And they'd come back a transformed animal, because they were learning in one psychodynamic sense, passive immobility, learning submission, if you wish, or passivity in basically a non-threatening way. Cradling, it works. But for pit bulls being rehabilitated in some animal shelters, the larger dogs, we do have to find another way. And I think that's a great challenge for the behaviorists, whether we can find some way of delivering oxytocin to help these animals, many of them also suffering from PTSD.
If you had them early enough, I think you're in luck, basically. Those are dogs that are flexible, is what everybody's saying. But I would think that the one thing you'd want to expose them to that nobody does is toddlers. Because that is a problem later on. And wouldn't it be nice to have a supply of toddlers to come by the shelter and try to hug your dogs?
Julie?
So this is about imitation and also following gestures. So in the video in Adam's presentation, and I assume others have had exposure to this, a person went and touched a bell with their hand, and the dog was trained to go and touch the bell with their paw, not their nose. And then a person picked up a cup with their hand, and the dog picked up the cup with their mouth. And so in the studies, when a person gestures and points at something and the dog goes to it with their nose, how do you qualify that that's responding to gesture and not imitation?
Okay, well, yeah. So these are two different situations, really. So one is the gesture experiment. So basically, when we're looking at the communication between people and the dog, you can do it at any time, anywhere, with any dogs. I mean, or most dogs. Maybe some people would disagree, but generally dogs that are exposed to humans, they are quite well going with the situation. So that is more like in a communicative case, where actually the human action informs the dog about something which might be important in the environment. Now, in the case of the imitation, the assumption is, and what you saw is actually was part of the training. So also how you train a dog that understands the rule, that when there is an action that I'm doing, then this is really that, or the demonstrator is doing, then he should perform something similar. The pointing, when I'm doing the pointing action, is not actually touching the object. I'm indicating the object that's there. When you're doing the imitation, there's an action that the person performs. And very often these actions have no meaning. So for example, if I'm making a body action, turning around my own body, then I don't show anything. There's no communicative meaning to that. It's just an action, and then the dog can respond to it by doing the same action. So I think imitation is more about learning about the environment by observing or through observing the others acting out something and modify and having an interaction with objects in the environment, compared into the situation where you could call more like communication, where the observer, if you like, the receiver of the signal is actually responding to the sort of information, let's put it this way, what is expressed by the sender. So here I see the basic distinction.
Okay, well, I do agree with that distinction, but I also think you're onto something. And where'd you go? In that there is a debate about something that's very close to imitation that is also sometimes compared to pointing, and that's stimulus or local enhancement. And so when you look into the scientific literature, and you define true imitation very strictly in that point-for-point matching, which Adam mentioned, but he said that he was relaxing that a bit. That's very distinct from what happens when you follow pointing. But there are sort of these continuums or variants of these types of behaviors. So for example, stimulus and local enhancement is often described as sort of a step away from imitation, in that the animal is going to that area or that object because you're nearby. And so if you compare that to pointing, and your point happens to be close to that object, it's very difficult to tell those two things apart. In fact, it's very likely that what you see going on there is stimulus enhancement, which, by that relaxed definition of imitation, could be the same thing. As you move further away, it's possible that those things become more distinct, but we don't know that for sure. We don't know exactly at what point those two things are distinct. So there may be relationships between these types of behaviors, but at some point we tend to define them differently. And those rules are often set by us as scientists. And so sometimes we make some assumptions about why they're different, but there are those comparisons as well.
Another question with for example, where the person turned around and then the dog turned around. Was that the dog responding to a cue that they were trained to respond to, or were they imitating the person?
Well, in our experiment, that was a cue. So you have to see this in two parts. One is the training part, which means that you have to teach the dog the rule of imitation. And in order to teach the rule of this rule, you need some behaviors, because you can't explain the dog on what to do. I mean, it's just not possible, unfortunately. They don't speak and don't understand this thing. So you have to do that. And then after, what I haven't got really time to show you, that what comes after is more interesting. Once the dog understands this rule of imitation, then you can try and use this knowledge or base your knowledge in a new situation. So now you can go out and do something relatively new. We had this discussion in the break, what is new and what is not so new. But you can do new things and give the command and see whether the dog really now has this idea, okay, I have to do something similar. And from that point on, he's not looking most of the time for particular signals, but we think, at least based on our experiments, he really tries to do something similar what was suggested by your action. So moving the object in the same way what you just shown him, even if it's a new object or he has seen the object for the first time.
Adam, would I be correct in drawing an analogy that's like teaching the rule of Simon Says to kids?
Yes, I mean, that's the same. And I think I even would suggest that actually dogs know that rule from the beginning. So they have, I mean, they are social animals. So I will be discussing with Mike this also before, that they know this rule. So puppies are imitating other dogs, other dogs or other puppies. The problem is that very often in a human household, but maybe in other situations, they actually are not finding this useful. So if you go out in the garden and start to dig, and your dog also starts to dig, you probably don't find it's a good idea that the dog is imitating everything what you're doing. So very early you bring, or the puppies do imitating. So very early the puppies actually learn that they should not imitate. Now what we are doing actually just in these experiments, we rehabilitating them in a sense that now they are allowed to imitate, but in particular situations. So I think we don't making anything strange. We just reactivating an old or a talent that the dog anyway would have, but in a normal situation, you just want to stop them imitating at any time and anywhere.
Ray, are you looking to jump in here, or are you just?
No, we got a question over there.
Okay.
I wanted to go back to the critical period for just a moment, if we could. I was wondering if there is any significant difference in the amount of time it takes or specific techniques for socializing different things such as humans, non-human, non-dog animals, and then just inanimate objects? Or is it just a positive experience while being bombarded with the sensations of said object?
As far as the different studies that have been done with dogs being socialized to other species, there doesn't seem to be a difference with humans versus anything else, as I think Adam was kind of mentioning earlier. As far as inanimate objects, there hasn't been as much done with dogs in specific, but there has been work with birds. For example, if a block of wood is moving, a duck will attach to it. So I wouldn't be surprised if you could do a similar sort of thing with dogs. They certainly attach to environments and things like that, so they'll get familiar with anything. And the only reason it takes different time is what time period you're doing it in. So if you're between the 4 and 8 weeks, the closer to 4 weeks it is, the faster it happens. If you're outside 4 and 8 weeks, it takes longer.
Adam?
I just want to add to that we didn't did formal experiments on this, but when we raised our wolves, the only big difference between our procedure was that we had our dogs raised by university students. So not in a wolf park where you have the few people. And what our students did, because they got the puppy, but they had to go to the lectures, so they took the puppy everywhere. So our first puppies probably were socialized to about 100 people, during this time. And what we found, this was not published, and what we experienced, that these wolves, even if they were 1-2 years old, they were just fascinated by anybody. So I think the lesson for this is that in a sensitive period, what the function is learning about who belongs to your group family. Now, if you have 5 or 6, that's it. But if you have 100, there's no biological constraint, at least I think, that you cannot learn about more. So I think if you have the means to, this just depends on how intensive you can expose these animals to objects or people, then this could help a lot if you want a well-socialized puppy.
I just want to make a little bit of clarification, although I totally agree with your point. I can't speak for all wolf parks, but I can speak to some extent for a wolf park where several of us have reared wolves or helped raise these wolves and socialized them. And they are exposed to many, many people, not just the few people at the park. It's open to the public. Visitors come in. Select individuals can come and interact with those puppies, and they're exposed to many, many people throughout their life, both from the outside observing and even coming in and socializing them. So they are also very intensely socialized. And you'll hear a bit tomorrow about their social behavior, and you see it's also very, very developed.
And I would just add that there's a difference between being interested in a person and being socially bonded to them. So while I think being exposed to lots of people for the wolves makes them less fearful of people coming to visit, for sure, they still don't show the same attachment to all those other people that they do to the people who are actually with them the most.
Clive, you've been very quiet, so I have a tweet for you.
Oh, no.
We actually have a few for you, but I wanted to in the study, I can't find it, but I remember the question. It had to do with Erica's study.
Okay.
With the petting. And there are a few comments regarding that there's an innate misunderstanding in the research that kind of petting might just seem there's a confusion between aversive and reinforcement regarding the difference between the social and the food reinforcement. Can you comment on the nature of the social interaction? I think there's a confusion that the claim isn't that the social interaction is, there's a very specific context to that work, right?
Yeah.
You want to jump in on this, or?
Well, I'm still not quite sure if I understand the question. I can certainly clarify the experiment and mention a follow-up experiment. So the human social contact that Erica was offering in that experiment was gentle petting and stroking, combined at the same time with encouraging words. And it produced that very slight evidence that it might be, for some dogs, slightly better than nothing. And actually, of course, that averages across a group of animals. I'm afraid I don't remember how many were in the group. The one fact I remember is that there was one dog who was really enthusiastic about the social reward, and that dog was actually one of the shelter dogs. And that was the one dog that was really enthusiastic about it. In subsequent experiments, Erica has actually separated out the touching from the speaking. And what I find very interesting is that the touching is the part that does have some impact. The speaking means nothing. The speaking is absolutely and completely worthless in that kind of a context. What Erica has then moved on to is experiments where the dogs have to do even less to get the reward. She already started with what she presumed was a very simple response, but she's moved on to simply a situation where the dogs simply have to come into proximity. And if they come within 1 meter of her, she then either gives them some food, or pets them, or talks to them. Under those conditions, the talking remains completely useless. So it's an ongoing study. I wouldn't want to make some wild blanket claim that my students and I have proved that dogs have no interest in anything people provide beyond food. All I want to claim is that it's not as straightforward as our intuitive sense of what it's like living with these animals leads us to believe, that there are contexts where what we say and how we touch them is not worth much to them.
Can I say something? Well, I think this highlights in an interesting way exactly the methods that we're using for all our studies, which is relevant for everybody who's doing cognitive research. The specific methods are really important. When we get a glimpse at them, then we have a lot of potential things that we could say about them. And for instance, my glimpse at that study, and I don't know it well, is that with a shelter dog, that kind of petting isn't necessarily reinforcing at all. In fact, that does feel possibly quite aversive, as perhaps that person, the questioner, was asking. And in the context of a home situation, by contrast, why does a dog have to do anything for that social reward? That dog gets the social reward all the time, so it doesn't surprise me at all. So the comparison falls apart if it's not the same type of behavior for the dog, the social petting. Then you don't have a comparison, and I feel like all that's happened is you've kind of slightly rubbed the shelter dogs the wrong way and given them a little food and then walked away from them, which bothers me.
I'm not sure I exactly follow you, but I'll step away.
I think that's the problem.
I'll step away, and I'll make a meta point. I mean, if you want to know, do an experiment. It's cheap, right?
Wait,
I mean,
what is the question that you were answering?
well, I want to know, what do dogs get out of people? I mean, I want to know, what are people for dogs? And I don't want to just repeat what the stories, our cultural stories, which after all, if we were in some other part of the world, would be completely different cultural stories, right? Different cultures have very different stories about what dogs are and what good they are for people.
Answer the question, what are people to dogs? It's unless your only possibilities are they're rubbers of the head or they're providers of pepperoni, right? And those aren't, I mean, we know already, certainly, that we're providers of food and provisioners of food, and everything about domestication means that that's why we're together, and so forth. But so that particular choice of social reward, I'm not sure that would. I don't see how that tests your hypothesis.
Try the experiment.
But I'm not interested in that hypothesis.
People are very surprised. People who have their dogs and you do this with them and their dogs, they are very surprised.
Yeah, but I get that my dog gets that for nothing. You don't have to, I mean, if you're going to add a series of things my dog has to do suddenly in order to get my love, then maybe they would learn to do that series of things. But they're not going to do it ab initio because, hey, I come in the door and I give them a rub on the head.
Well, I don't know. It surprised me.
That's the answer I want.
Well, there's also, I think, we're talking about very, very broad ideas. If we just look at the bar graph, we see food and social, and that can create a assumption in our mind that we're making a very, very broad claim about multiple phenomena. But there's also a context. In one of Erica's other studies, I believe, she was also looking at the same phenomena with or without the presence of food, I believe. And was it Erica or was it another one in your lab?
Erica. I'm trying to remember which study.
I remember, she put it on Facebook, if I'm not, from your lab.
Yeah.
It showed a dog, and it was actually a poster card for one of the shelter dogs, that when the food was taken away, that the pets were extraordinarily reinforcing. And so there was a context there whether or not the food was present as well.
Right. So yeah, she's doing a study, or has done a study, where she fades out the food to see if the dogs move over towards the social, and some do and some don't.
Right.
So yeah. It's interesting.
But just to comment, I think the inherent limitations of this kind of experiment you expressed to begin with, saying that you were siding with Nico Tinbergen, that to look at animals objectively rather than to consider the subjective, which Konrad Lorenz urged. And I will be addressing that a little bit more in my presentation tomorrow.
Ray, do you have a question for the panel?
Yes, I have a question, as long as we're picking on Clive. I think this is a good time to ask him a question. Is that, Clive, I don't mind you using my slides in your lecture. In fact, I was kind of proud because the pictures you showed that I took showed wonderful, healthy village dogs that were reasonably unattached. And then you went and showed pictures of, at the end of your research trip down there, and they were terrible. They were skinny and bad, and you kind of implied that that's kind of what village dogs are all about. And I think that you loaded that question in an interesting way, is that the dogs that you showed that were really in poor shape were females that had just finished lactating. And the dogs down there that the hunters were using were good-looking dogs. The dogs that I showed from the Mexico City dump are beautiful dogs. Their conformation is beautiful. They're all in good shape. But they were all males, all but one. All right, so the dog out in the front was a female in heat, and those were all males. So do you think, as a general rule, on the dogs around the world, that the males are better than the females?
So I don't think I actually disagree with you about any of this. As far as I can detect, I may be a bit simple about it. I mean, yeah, village dogs in something like the Mexico City dump are in very good condition. And the contrast I was trying to make was between the dogs of the mosquito people and the dogs of the Mayangna people, and they live in what, to somebody who's not much more than a tourist, look like roughly similar kinds of villages with similar levels of provisioning for the human beings. But there's this interesting difference that one group of people take their dogs hunting with them, give them names, give them value, within their limited resources attempt to care for them, and the other group of people did not appear to do that. The dogs, I admit it was quite a superficial observation, but the dogs appeared to be in worse shape. That wasn't the Mexico City dump. It doesn't offer the resources to the village dogs that a major city dump could.
I'm going to jump in here because we can continue arguing about this over scotch later. I want to jump over to one last question, the audience, as we're running out of time.
My question is regarding the bones. It's not really a question. Is there a possibility that the puppy with the woman could be a spirit animal? in the Native Americans, as they will have spirit animals?
Yes, it's a distinct possibility, but how do we know? I mean,
We don't know.
That's what I was saying. We don't have any narratives to go with that. So it seems quite plausible that these animals, the animal parts, the puppy, the deer antlers, the fox teeth, whatever, are buried with these people because those animals meant something to those people.
Yes.
But what it is, I mean, we don't know. I mean, it's a deep mystery. It's a deep mystery. It's quite an eerie thing to think about.
Just didn't know if that had been considered.
I believe it has.
Okay.
Ray, do you want the final comment?
Yeah, it's just so story time. Is that your fox teeth, and they looked a little big for fox teeth for me, all had a hole in the top of them, and they were obviously a necklace.
And Fox
That's
agrees
right.
with you there, looking at those teeth.
Yeah, and so if it's a lady, I don't know who it was, but perhaps she was buried with her necklace. I've thought of 100 just so stories on the lady with the puppy and the guy with the antler. I think that the guy with the antler is that deer stabbed him to death. And so they killed the deer and they sent him off to the happy hunting ground. I think that the puppy is that in that section of the world in Natufia, there's some little evidence that they ate those animals, that they're on a migratory path and so forth. And so they sent the lady to the happy hunting grounds with lunch. And that's why she was holding it so closely in her hand. I mean, it could just go on forever and ever. And I don't know why anybody would spend any time on that carcass with so little information. I got one more for you. Is that rabies broke out in the village, and that was the puppy that bit her that gave her the rabies. And so they sent it off as a...
Clive, you want to... Okay. With that, we are definitely out of time. Thank you for joining us today. Join us tomorrow for the final day, cognition, cognitive behavior, and developments. We've got some fascinating presentations lined up. We will begin tomorrow at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, and thank you for being with us today.